Hello and welcome to today's lecture, which is all about World War II. You might remember that the last time we talked, there was Nazi German demands upon Poland. This is the same thing that Hitler was doing throughout the 1930s, trying to get ethnic Germans into Nazi Germany, and by moving the borders, he did that, of course, with Austria. He did that with Czechoslovakia and the Sudetenland, and then he was making demands upon Poland. The Poles did not relent, and France and Britain backed them, and Nazi Germany invades Poland. Nazi Germany invaded Poland with a new kind of tactic, which is an attempt to overcome the trench warfare of World War I. This new tactic is called blitzkrieg or lightning warfare. And the blitzkrieg is when you combine armored vehicles on the ground with close air support airplanes in the sky to smash the opposition. The armored vehicles take over a great deal of territory, cut through the enemy's lines, sow confusion and discord way behind the lines, interrupting communications and supply and command units in the back. So blitzkrieg tactics were very useful. They're very powerful at this point in time, and really no one knows how to defend against them. Poland was the first victim of the blitzkrieg. So Poland is being defeated really quite quickly by the Germans, and France and Britain then declare war upon Nazi Germany, but they don't try to attack Nazi Germany to try to save the Poles. Britain brings its troops over across the English Channel, and Britain and France are, I suppose, just waiting for the Germans to finish off Poland and then attack France. This is the so-called phony war or sitting war, the Sitzkrieg, where nothing happens for a period of months. Meanwhile, back in the East, just 2 weeks after Nazi Germany invaded Poland, the Soviet Union invades from the other side and takes over about a third of Poland, as well as the Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia. This was all part of the Nazi-Soviet Mutual Non-Aggression Pact, which had been signed just weeks earlier. Both Germany and the Soviet Union do terrible things to the Polish people. They don't want any kind of resistance to either Nazism or communism, and so the Polish leadership class is rounded up either by German special purpose units called Einsatzgruppen or by the Soviet NKVD or their secret police. They're taken away and basically they're murdered. And we're talking about politicians and officers in the army and perhaps upper churchmen and university professors and so on. Really, the leadership class of Poland is completely done away with by these two totalitarian states. It's a very sad thing that happens. Here you have a Stuka dive bomber. This would be the kinds of airplanes that would be attacking the ground with, as you see on the right, an armored vehicle and soldiers following up that armored vehicle. The planes and the armored vehicles together, of course, are the new lightning war tactics. Happens very quickly, very much unlike what you had in World War I with all of that trench warfare, and really seems like nothing ever got taken over, nothing ever changed. The Blitzkrieg is unleashed upon Western Europe starting in April of 1940, going through June of 1940. The Germans invaded Denmark and Norway and took those two countries over fairly quickly. They wanted to ensure that the British fleet was not able to get into the Baltic. The Germans also then invaded the Benelux countries of Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg, and are able to flatten them also with the Blitzkrieg, and then get to the actual bigger countries or bigger armies of France and Britain in France, and do the exact same thing to the French and the British armies in France that they had done to the Poles and these smaller countries, smashing through their lines with tanks and planes, and really brings France to surrender in June of 1940. Now, Italy was watching what was going on and was waiting for, kind of waiting to see what happened when the Germans invaded France. And suddenly, Mussolini fears that the war is going to be over before he has a chance to get in on it. And so he orders an attack from Italy into France in June of 1940. And unlike what the Germans were doing, the Italians don't seem to have the blitzkrieg tactics down, and they have a very difficult time making any headway whatsoever against the French troops. And this probably should have been a warning to Mussolini that the Italians were not um, able to kind of keep up with the big boys. But in fact, he doesn't take a lesson from that. And you'll see him trying to attack other places really quite soon. Well, the French surrender in June 1940. The British army is still basically on French soil and needs to get off French soil as quickly as possible or be run over by those tanks in the blitzkrieg tactics. They assemble around a place called Dunkirk, a port city on the English Channel, and the Germans stop. They don't annihilate the British troops or the French troops that are with them, and the British are able to put together an amazing flotilla of ships, from large warships to fishing vessels and pleasure yachts and everything else, and are able to actually evacuate many of the British troops who were in France at this point in time. They rescue about 300,000 British troops, which then gives Britain the possibility of defending against a possible German amphibious attack if that were to happen. This is kind of a heroic moment in defeat, actually, in June of 1940. Here you can see the Germans' lines of assault getting around the Maginot Line, which is the fortifications that ran along the Franco-German border, smashing once again through Belgium, just like they had done in World War I, and then very quickly making it to Paris and beyond. Dunkirk, you might be able to see, is up there kind of between the English Channel and the North Sea. Well, a lot of people have asked themselves why France collapsed so very quickly in June 1940. Did it have something to do with the left-right divide that split France going all the way back to the 1880s, 1890s? Or was it really simply the blitzkrieg tactics? And it's probably the blitzkrieg tactics, because really no nation is able to stand up against the kinds of blitzkrieg tactics that the Germans were first doing. But then towards the end of the war, Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union are also using blitzkrieg tactics in order to defeat Nazi Germany. So France was defeated, and it was occupied, or at least 3/5 of it was occupied by the Germans. This is the part that could possibly be invaded on the Atlantic Ocean. 2/5 of France was left under a puppet government or a collaborator government. And ironically or sadly, the person who was in charge of that was the hero of the Battle of Verdun from World War I, a guy by the name of Henri Pétain. This is a right-wing state that made right-wing people in France from that left-right divide very happy. It's a nearly fascist state, and it's a state then that the Germans don't really have to worry about controlling that territory, since you have far right-wing people in control of it, allied with the Germans. There is also a free French government in exile under Charles de Gaulle, who is a military officer, and he basically becomes the face of free France, or France that is not either occupied or collaborating with the Germans. Here's France and its division, 3/5. 2/5, you can see the town of Vichy, which was the capital of Vichy, France. You can also see in this map, kind of up on the right-hand side, or in the eastern part of France, the annexed zone. This is Alsace-Lorraine. Once again, it goes back to the Germans. Well, Britain stands alone at this point in time. Really, in May of 1940, Neville Chamberlain, this guy who had been hoodwinked by Hitler back at the Munich conference in 1938 and had promised in their time, he gave up being prime minister, and Winston Churchill takes over. Most people expect that Churchill is going to surrender to the Germans or negotiate a treaty with the Germans once France has been defeated, but Churchill is really quite a powerful character with a lot of resolve, and he decides that the British cannot abide by having Nazi Germany dominate Europe, and so he gives these fiery speeches both to the House of Commons and also to the British people about how they're going to fight on the beaches, or they're going to fight in the villages, they'll fight in the towns, they'll do whatever they have to do in order to defeat the Nazi menace. And so he doesn't make peace with the Germans. And so the Germans decide that they're going to smash Britain by air at first, and then eventually invade with a kind of seaborne invasion. This air campaign against Britain is called the Battle of Britain in 1940, and it's a very close deal. It seems like for a period of time the British are going to run out of airplanes or pilots, but due to some mistakes by the Germans, this is really Hitler who tells the Air Force that they should be attacking towns instead of attacking airfields in order to break the morale of the British people and have the British people then demand that their leaders negotiate with the Nazis because they're being bombed and because they don't like that. Well, bombing from the air is something that happens quite frequently in World War II, and it never has its intended effect, the effect of breaking the will or breaking the morale of the people who are being bombed. It really just makes the people who are being bombed hate their enemy even more and rally around the government. So the British are able, over a longer period of time, to defeat the Germans who keep attacking Britain by air, and the Battle of Britain ends. Here's a spotter who is looking for German bombers and then would, of course, have some way of telling people that an air raid was imminent. And here's a picture of St. Paul's Cathedral in London through the window of a destroyed house. Well, Mussolini was feeling pretty bad about not being able to invade France successfully in June of 1940, and he needs to really prove himself to his own people and to his Nazi partners that he is, a capable fascist ally. And so, without warning the Germans, he decides to invade Greece from Albania, a territory which the Italians had taken over. And the assault into Greece does not go well. The Greeks start to push the Italians back into Albania, and Mussolini asks then for German help. The Germans rescue them by invading Greece, but in order to do so, they had to make their way through Yugoslavia. And Yugoslavia did not want to allow the Germans to simply move through. And so Yugoslavia becomes a nation that is conquered, but then it also devolves into a kind of nasty, both civil war and then Nazi occupation of Yugoslavia at that point in time. The Italians also attempted to invade Egypt from their colony right next door, Libya. They had an overwhelming majority or overwhelming superiority in numbers of troops. It was something like 300,000 Italian troops invading Egypt, which was being defended by 30,000 British troops, and more or less the Italians end up surrendering to the British, even though they had 10-to-1 superiority. The Italians then asked the Germans to send them some troops to North Africa to help things out down there, and so the so-called Afrika Korps is sent and stabilizes the situation. They don't really put a lot of resources into fighting in North Africa because really the big show is about to start, which is Operation Barbarossa. June of 1941, this is the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. Nazism as a philosophy is a kind of hyper-racial nationalism, and Bolshevism or communism or Marxism is the ideological opposite of that, really just all about working men of the world unite, allegedly. And so Nazism has in its kind of core value the destruction of Bolshevism and the destruction of what they would call the Jewish race. By invading the Soviet Union, they are doing both. They're both trying to destroy communism, but then they're also going to be able to get their hands on a lot of Jewish people who they will sadly attempt to annihilate as well. The Blitzkrieg has great success in this Operation Barbarossa for a period of time. It's about 3 million soldiers, the vast majority of them German, but with also some Eastern European allies like Bulgaria and Romania and Finland against Stalin's troops. Stalin had purged the officer corps before World War II broke out, and so there are a number of younger officers, inexperienced officers who are in charge, who are afraid of giving orders that would perhaps anger Stalin and get them shot, and so they are, simply unwilling to give orders for a period of time. Stalin too was convinced that the Nazis would never attack because they had a mutual non-aggression pact, and even on the night before the Great Invasion happened, there was a German deserter, a former communist, who went across the lines, went into the Soviet Union, told some soldiers that he found that a huge invasion was imminent, and they went up the chain of command all the way up to Stalin and told Stalin that they had a defector who said that an invasion was imminent and that they should make preparations. And Stalin simply says, "That man's a liar, have him shot," which they do. And of course, the next morning, Operation Barbarossa starts, and the Germans catch the Russians unprepared. The Germans, with their blitzkrieg tactics, reached the gates of Moscow by early winter of 1941. The Russians had suffered at this point in time something like 2.5 million casualties. That would be people captured and people killed. The Germans, though, are at this point in time having a little bit of difficulty because Russia is extremely cold and Germans are not used to that kind of extreme cold. Many of the troops were still outfitted more or less in their summer gear, and their vehicles, their animals, and their soldiers themselves are not prepared for general winter or just the way that the winter is. And it's an extremely cold winter in 1941-42 in the Soviet Union and Russia. There's also the scorched earth policy that the Russians are using, just like they did when Napoleon invaded, of trying to destroy everything in the path of the invaders so that nothing is left for them. Probably sounds familiar to you. Here you can see an assault to the north, an assault to the center, an assault to the south in this Operation Barbarossa, and you can see, as it says, the areas of fierce fighting. The Germans are oftentimes able to surround and force the surrender of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of soldiers at this point. In 1942, once the weather warms up, the Germans renew their assault into the Soviet Union, this time putting a lot of emphasis on going to the south and the east. They want to take over some industrial towns. There's one in particular that they're interested in, and then some oil fields beyond those industrial towns. There is a town called Stalingrad, Stalin City, that the Germans need to take over, both because it's a major industrial city, but also because of the propaganda value of being named after, this godlike totalitarian leader of the Soviet Union. The Sixth Army invades Stalingrad, and they are surprised to be counterattacked by a large army of Russians, and they are cut off from the rest of the German army. Hitler orders them to stay and fight. They are told that they're going to be supplied by the air, but that is impossible. The Russians then are able to fight in Stalingrad, and eventually the Germans end up surrendering in Stalingrad, and an entire German army is lost. From that point in time on, really there are more and more Russian troops available, more and more equipment available to those troops, and the Russians or the Soviets are able to overwhelm the German army and push them back into Eastern Europe and then eventually back to Nazi Germany. It helps at this point in time that Japan gambled on attacking the United States in Pearl Harbor and then trying to take over a lot of Asia in order to get at natural resources. Instead of what they could have done was to attack the Soviet Union and keep pressure on the Soviets to keep troops fighting them. For the Russians, this is the Great Patriotic War. They give 100% to defeat the invaders. In fact, some of the people, when the Germans first invaded, welcomed the Germans as liberators from Stalin and Stalinism. But it turns out very quickly, or they realize very quickly, that the Germans have these racial attitudes, that the Germans are so-called Aryans, that they are racially superior to the Slavic people, Ukrainians and Russians and so on, who they're taking over. And the Germans commit terrible atrocities. Stalin had starved 3 million or so people to death in the 1930s in Ukraine, but it seems like Hitler and the Nazis want to eventually kill every Slavic person in Ukraine and in the Soviet Union. And so the people of the Soviet Union rally around Stalin in order to fight these horrible invaders who have these Lebensraum plans to, wipe them out and resettle the Soviet Union with Aryan people or German people. This is a huge loss for the people of Russia or for the Soviet Union. There are about 20 million people who are killed in World War II. A number of people that just boggles the mind. About 10% of the population is lost. Probably 10 million or so are soldiers, and 10 million or so are civilians. A couple of major battles would be what the Stalingrad that I mentioned before. There was also a major battle, probably the largest tank battle in the history of the world, at a place called Kursk, which ends up being kind of a draw or a small German defeat. You can imagine that losing 10% of your population, losing millions of people, left the Soviet Union with an enduring fear of invasion, and it also sadly left many people subjected to bombarded by propaganda. The belief that Stalin was a great hero of World War II and that Stalin had won World War II for the Russian people or for the Soviet people. In reality, Stalin's orders really made the loss of life even greater with his impatience and foolishness. And so it's not true, but in a totalitarian state, people know. The United States, as you are aware, I'm sure, was attacked on December 7th, 1941 by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor. The Philippines also were attacked by the Japanese. That is more or less imperial conquest of the United States from an earlier period of time. The Germans, I think, don't really care that much that the United States is in the war. This is a foolish thing on their part. They viewed the United States already as an ally of Britain because the United States was already providing Britain with a lot of war material, even though officially it was supposed to be neutral. It was a kind of arsenal of democracy supporting Britain, the one remaining democracy in Europe. And so the United States jumps into this war. The Germans declare war on the United States. And the United States, just like in World War I, needs about a year to prepare its industry, to prepare its equipment, and to prepare its soldiers and get them over to help, at the very least, defend Britain. There's a war going on in Asia against Japan, and there's a war going on in Europe against Nazi Germany. And Britain and the United States agree to concentrate on Europe first, defeat the Nazis first, and then deal with Japan. The Soviets want the United States and Britain to invade Europe as soon as possible. They want a second front as soon as possible because they are really just using up a lot of men and a lot of material and trying to fight the Nazis in this really desperate fight in Eastern Europe. And from the Soviet point of view, the United States and Britain take a really long period of time before they actually do assault the Germans in a very direct way. Here is one of the many famous images of Pearl Harbor and the battleships that were sunk at Pearl Harbor. 1942, 1943, the United States seemed to nibble around the edges of Europe or attack Nazi Germany in a kind of indirect way, much to Stalin's chagrin. They invade North Africa first and get rid of the Afrika Korps and the remaining Italian soldiers in North Africa. They then invade Sicily, kind of like Garibaldi did way back in the day. And then finally they make it onto Italy. When Italy is invaded, the support for Mussolini evaporates and he's overthrown. Italy itself surrenders in September of 1943, and the Germans who are in Italy there to support Mussolini continue to occupy the parts of Italy that they had. Mussolini was imprisoned, and a commando team is sent to rescue him. They glide in on gliders. They break him out of prison. They put him in a glider, and they glide off with him. It would be a wonderful movie for somebody to make, a rescue movie of Mussolini, but I think really nobody wants to see that, so sadly it's not going to be made. But Mussolini was rescued. He was made a kind of puppet dictator of a kind of puppet state called the Northern Italian Socialist Republic, but essentially his career is over. In 1944, the Russians are continuing to advance westward. They're really taking the fight to the Germans. The United States and Britain invade France on June 6th, 1944, so-called D-Day. And the Blitzkrieg tactics, both by the Russians and then also by the British and Americans, go a long way to fairly quickly liberate France from the east, and then in the west, it's the liberation of Eastern Europe. Well, liberation is probably a questionable term, but certainly the Soviets taking over Eastern Europe. France is liberated by the United States and Britain, and the Germans are pushed back to the border between France and Germany. And a surprise attack happens in December of 1944, the so-called Battle of the Bulge. The Germans have a counterattack. Everybody thought that the Germans were finished by the end of 1944, but they had kind of pulled some troops together. They attack a bulge in the lines of the British and the Americans, but are unable to make very much headway against the United States or British troops at this point in time. And the Rhine River is bridged. Troops are flooding into Germany, and the end of the war is really pretty near at that point in time. Although I've described some of the bigger battles and a rescue or two, really we need to talk a bit about strategic wars that were going on. The Germans, just like in World War I, were attempting to starve the British with submarines. And more or less just like in World War I, new technologies and the convoy system of a bunch of ships coming together, going across the ocean together and then surrounded by warships, defeats the menace of the submarines. The Blitz, the so-called Blitz of Germans attacking from the air, attacking Britain from the air, was a terror campaign that was trying to break the British morale, but it is unsuccessful. Later in the war, the United States and Britain attempt to destroy German industry and also break the German morale through strategic bombing with gigantic bombers. About 1 out of every 3 German buildings is destroyed by this air campaign, but ironically or oddly, the Germans are able to continue to produce more or less what they needed throughout the war, and production was really not seriously affected. You can see a submarine, you can see a heavy bomber, and then you can see how some German towns and cities were really quite decimated by the strategic bombing. In 1945, large numbers of Germans who were about to fall into the hands of the Soviets tried to flee before the Soviet army got to them. It was winter, and so it was really quite difficult for that to happen, and a lot of Germans get caught by the Soviets, and the Soviets are really interested in revenge. The Germans, with their attitudes, with their racial attitudes and their murderous atrocities, the Soviets felt like they deserved to be given the same kind of treatment when the Soviets started to take over German people, and so that happens. The Germans themselves much preferred to surrender to American and British troops, and would much rather be occupied by American and British troops because of this revenge factor that the Soviets had, that really the Americans and the British didn't have so much of. The Soviets were allowed to battle for Berlin and are able to take over Berlin once again, sort of hastily or precipitously, and lose many more troops than perhaps they needed to. Hitler doesn't leave Berlin. He stays in Berlin in his bunker and commits suicide on April 30th, 1945. And then the Germans unconditionally surrendered to the Allies on May 8th, 1945. Here you can see the Soviets putting up a flag in Berlin. And then here you also see the General Alfred Jodl, who is signing the surrender terms for the Germans. Well, World War II has about 20 million deaths of soldiers or military deaths, but also has about 20 million civilian deaths. And Europe was really completely devastated in the areas where the fighting raged, and it rages really in much of the continent. Right-wing dictatorships, which had become very popular in the interwar period, and fascism, which became very popular in the interwar period, were completely discredited by World War II. Racism of the kind that was really quite common in the 1880s, 1890s, 1900 is also discredited as people realize that ranking different kinds of peoples as superior or inferior species of human beings eventually leads to the kind of genocide that happens under the Nazis. This is also a longer term solution to a German problem, the German irredentism and the Germans upsetting the balance of power when they first unified in 1871 and when they attempted to dominate Europe in World War II and didn't get that chance to do so. These are solved by a complete and total German defeat and a German occupation of Germany by the winning powers. And there is no German government for a period of years after World War II. This is really a cataclysm and a kind of hour zero, or kind of restarting the clock, where a lot of nations could completely do things differently, both internally and also in terms of foreign relations. Things have a chance to start over or to change dramatically from what was before. And what comes out of this situation is really the beginning of two superpowers or super blocks. One a capitalist democratic West, and the other a planned economy dictatorial East. And of course, throughout the World War, technology advances really quite quickly because in order to win the war, technological advancements were made in airplanes and tanks, weaponry of all kinds, and of course in nuclear power and having the atomic bomb. I hope you enjoyed today's lecture, and there will be more in the coming days. Thanks so much. If you have any questions, send me an email and let me know. Have a great day.